The dreadful day is looming right around the corner. And no, I'm not talking about Donald Trump's inauguration date. I'm talking about the day that TikTok is set to ban on January 19th.
Today's oral arguments, the Supreme Court appears ready to uphold a ban on TikTok that is set to take effect in 9 days. The popular app is used by as many as 170 million users in the U.S. A bipartisan law orders TikTok to shut down in 9 days unless it finds a new owner that is not in China or the Supreme Court takes action.
To give you some background, lawmakers fear that through TikTok, China could acquire Americans' private data or could push propaganda that would sow discord. It's a risk that TikTok's lawyer acknowledged to the 9 justices this morning.
That they would use that information over time to develop spies, to turn people, to blackmail people, people who a generation from now will be working in the FBI or the CIA or in the State Department. Is that not a realistic assessment by Congress and the President of the risks here?
Well, Your Honor, I'm not disputing the risks. I certainly acknowledge the risk, but I think there are lots of reasons, not just the one I just gave, but there are lots of reasons why that risk still can't justify the law.
And though the questions that are being asked are very, very valid, I often think to myself, isn't American social media companies doing the same thing, if not worse, to us? Advertising anything from Russian propaganda to right-wing propaganda all the time.
Tactics that Russia is using now compare to what you saw in 2020 and back in 2016?
Well, they've evolved their techniques from generating and launching content from, for instance, St. Petersburg. That's what we saw in 2016. You had the Internet Research Agency operating out of an office building, almost like, a normal business. Over time, though, given the improvements in the intelligence community, cyber command, and our own awareness of the activities and what they're doing, they've started to push the boundaries out. And so they're actually generating content and then they're laundering it effectively through other platforms like Telegram. And even now what we're seeing is a significant amount of laundering through X. And then U.S. citizens pick up this information and pick up these videos, and then they promote it on their own accounts and on their own social media platforms like Facebook. So they're moving it out. They're avoiding the techniques that U.S. Law enforcement intelligence has deployed and developed. And so they're not.
An article that came out April 17, 2024, talks about Russia's influence on Facebook in the European Parliament elections. And it also gave me a little insight onto why somebody like Mark Zuckerberg would decide to backtrack on his fact-checking policies after Russia's own influence in our last 3 elections, according to FBI findings. It's clear that there's a hypocrisy here. And though I'm not saying that there's not a legitimate argument to the security threat that TikTok may pose, we have been dealing with these threats since way back in 2014 with Russia and have yet to really act on it in a significant manner. With Facebook, again, deciding to backtrack on its fact-checking and become more of a free speech hub, which doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's free speech is going to be heard. And though they have made it about information that China could be getting, I believe it's more about the political influence, especially on our youth. Because more than half of people under 30 are now starting to go to TikTok for information. And that cuts out the middleman.
Your Honor, is this case ultimately boils down to speech. What we're talking about is ideas. And my friends on the other side, when you cut through everything else, are ultimately worried that the ideas that appear on the TikTok platform could in the future somehow manipulate Americans, could somehow persuade them, could somehow get them to think something that they ought not be thinking. Well, that whole notion is at war with the First Amendment. If the First Amendment means anything, it means that the government cannot restrict speech in order to protect us from speech. That's precisely what this law does from beginning to end, whether you look at its text, Whether you look at the government's justifications in its brief, where they talk about being worried about speech criticizing our leaders or undermining democracy, it's what you see in the House report, which drains specifically on the dangers of misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. And it's what you see in this legislative record writ large, which is saturated with objections to TikTok's existing content. We ask that you